latest podcast, the Heidelcast.
It's a Heidel minicast. And now, Scott Clark.
How the Athanasian Creed could have helped us to avoid a giant theological chuckhole.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
There was a time when you could rely on social media, for example, the HRA posting links to various social media sites in order to find out what's happening on the Heidel blog and the Heidelcast. Well, they've sort of changed the rules in the way they're working now, and you really can't rely on them anymore to find content from the Heidelberg Reformation Association. You need to connect to us directly. You need to subscribe directly to the Heidelcast and the Heidel blog. Go to heidelblog.net/subscribe and type in your email address. And all we will do is send you daily one email with a rundown of everything that's on the Heidel blog and the Heidelcast for that day. Or you could, and maybe in addition to, download the app. And that'll be right there on your phone or your device. I've got it on my phone. I have it on my iPad, and I have it on my computer. That's the Heidel app, and you can get it from the App Store or from Google Play. And if you subscribe directly in these ways, then you don't have to rely on social media to decide whether you should see or hear what we have published that day. And what's happening, just to let you know what's going on behind the scenes, is that the social media companies essentially sell to their advertisers the amount of time you look at a site and how many people are looking at a site. And it's all about eyeballs, as they say in the business. And social media companies are really advertising companies, same as radio and television. And they pretend to be free. It's not free. They're selling you to their advertisers, and they're doing everything they can to get you to come frequently and to stay longer. And that means when we post a link to Heidelblog content or Heidelcast content, they don't like that because that takes your eyeballs away from their sites. So they're making it more difficult for you to see that stuff. So that's why I'm saying subscribe directly at the Heidel blog or get the app, and subscribe in Apple iTunes or Spotify or on YouTube.
The Heidelcast.
We've been talking about Christology here in this little mini-series to sort of support the weekly series on the Lord's Supper. And in this episode, I want to talk to you about how the Athanasian Creed could have helped evangelicals to avoid the chuckhole that is the doctrine of the eternal subordination of the Son. The Athanasian Creed says, in part, in section 33, equal to the Father, this is about Christ, as touching his deity, and, now listen to this, inferior to the Father as touching his humanity. That's what the Latin text says, and I even provided the Latin text for you so you could see for yourself. Every year in our Reformed Confessions course, we look at the Belgic Confession. We go through it really line by line, and of course that means every year we look at Articles 18 and 19 on the Incarnation and the two natures of Christ. And in order to understand what we say in the Belgic, you really need to understand the definition of Chalcedon from AD 451 and the Athanasian Creed. And we don't know exactly when that was written, certainly after the definition of Chalcedon, but exactly when that was, nobody really knows. But as we work our way through our shared inheritance from the Church Universal, of course, we come across the language that I already quoted for you from the Athanasian Creed. It's sometimes known, the creed is, as the Quincunque Vult. That's from the first two words of the creed, and it's whosoever will. And then the verb there is to be saved. Athanasius, of course, didn't write the Athanasian Creed. That was determined definitively by a scholar whose first name I don't know. It's usually just given as an initial, G. Maybe it was Gerhardus, but I don't know. His last name is Voss, V-O-S, and that was in the early 1640s. As I say, we don't know the date of the creed. It's been dated variously. It's widely taken as a good summary of the teaching of the ancient church on the doctrine of the Trinity and the doctrine of Christ, or Christology. It was warmly and enthusiastically received by Luther and is received by the Reformed churches as an ancient ecumenical creed. In Belgic Confession Article 9, We say, in this matter, we willingly accept the three ecumenical creeds, the Apostles', Nicene, and Athanasian, as well as what the ancient fathers decided in agreement with them. Now, as we look at Article 33 of the Athanasian, it's really impossible not to reflect on the contemporary confusion concerning the so-called eternal subordination of the Son. Now, just what that expression signifies has been hotly debated. For example, Wayne Grudem, in his book Biblical Foundations for Manhood and Womanhood, published in 2002, denies that the eternal subordination of the Son entails the ontological subordination of the Son. Ontological means being, so the subordination of the Son in his being to the Father is what is at question. Yet it has frequently seemed to Orthodox critics of the doctrine that it does entail more than mere voluntary submission of the Son to the Father, and that, at least in some cases, it entails the eternal subordination of the being of the Son to the Father. One of the functions of the ecumenical creeds and the Reformed confessions in the churches is to provide us with not only basic doctrines, but also distinctions, and this is what I really want to get to here, the vocabulary of the Holy Catholic Church.
Ladies and gentlemen, Scott Clark.
There is a way to talk about these doctrines in a way that doesn't cause confusion and that doesn't lead us into error. In every enterprise, there is always to be learned three things: grammar, logic, and rhetoric. Right? Whatever you're doing, there's always terms that you need to know about that field. You have to understand how those terms relate to each other, and then there's a way to talk about it. So there's the stuff to be learned, an explanation of how the stuff works, and how to talk about the stuff. And this is true whether we're learning how to fix engines or whether we're learning to do theology. I mean, think about it. If you say to a mechanic, well, the thingamajig is making a noise and I need it fixed, the mechanic is going to have to spend more time figuring out what the thingamajig is. He's going to ask you, or she's going to ask you, some diagnostic questions. There isn't actually under the hood any such thing called a thingamajig. And if a mechanic uses that language, you have a right to be concerned because that mechanic clearly doesn't know anything about engines. I don't know a great deal, but I know there's no such thing as a thingamajig. It means the mechanic hasn't bothered to learn the names of the parts on which he or she is working. And we can laugh about it if it's a mechanic because, after all, it's only a car or a truck or an SUV or something. But if the physician says, well, we cut out the what's-its, you want to say, hold on there. What exactly is the what's-it? Because if you went in to get something removed, it's really important that the physician takes out the right thing. So names do matter. Terms do matter. The relationship between things matters. And if it matters in medicine and mechanics, it matters that much more in theology, which deals with eternal matters. Further, we owe special respect to the ecumenical creeds because they represent not only the express ancient consensus of the church, but the express judgment of the church about particular issues. The ecumenical creeds don't speak about everything. For example, they don't say that baptism grants new life ex opere, meaning from the working of the sacrament, as many assume, for example, regarding the Nicene Creed. It doesn't actually say that. They do confess, however, what all Christians must believe, as the Athanasian says, whosoever will be saved must thus believe. That's what the Athanasian says. That's what it says at the very beginning. The confession of the Reformed Church has a similar function. Where it speaks, we, as Reformed Christians, are bound. And where it speaks, it gives us a vocabulary, a rhetoric, a way of talking about something. So this is, as I say, my main interest in this episode. And my thesis, my argument is, had the formulators of ESS, Eternal Subordination of the Son, and EFS, Eternal Functional Subordination, and ERAS, Eternal Relations of Authority and Submission, those are three different versions of essentially the same doctrine, right? Had they been more aware of the language of the Athanasian Creed, we probably would have avoided a great deal of confusion. Article 33 of the Athanasian gives us guide rails here. Christ is God the Son incarnate. He is one person with two distinct natures. Here I'm going to use the language of the definition of Chalcedon from AD 451. To be acknowledged in two natures is what we say. And here are the adverbs, and these are really important adverbs that are worth memorizing, actually. Immutably means unchangeably. Indivisibly, right? And so you can distinguish, but you can't divide. Inseparably, again, you can distinguish, but you can't separate. The distinction of the natures being by no means taken away by the union, but rather the property of each nature being preserved and concurring in one person and one subsistence, not parted or divided into two persons, but one and the same Son. So, what does that mean? The two natures never became one. That is the monophysite heresy. And as far as I'm concerned, that covers whether you say monophysite or miaphysite. They're both ways of saying one nature, and that's something that you can't say. So, one person, two natures. These natures never become one, and they always remain distinct. Yet Christ is one person. That's the ecumenical, ancient, universal Christian faith. One person, two natures. Whenever you hear someone talking about the doctrine of Christ, whatever that person says, it has to conform to one person, two natures. That's the baseline on which we all agree.
The Heidelcast.
And that Athanasian requires us to affirm, quoting here, according to deity, Christ is, quote, equal to the Father, close quote. According to his humanity or his human nature, however, Christ may be said to be minor patre, the Latin says. Minor is rightly translated inferior. And if you look on the Heidel blog, I've already cataloged some notable interpretations, for example, of 1 Corinthians 11:3 on this topic. So if you just search for 1 Corinthians 11:3, it will turn up. As Charles Hodge observed, it is Christ as the God-man, theanthropos, that is in view in 1 Corinthians 11:3. I mention that because sometimes defenders of the so-called eternal subordination of the Son appeal to 1 Corinthians 11:3. They don't distinguish between the two natures. The Logos, that is the second person of the Trinity, as such, is not in view in 1 Corinthians 11:3. In other words, Paul's writing about God the Son as he is incarnate, not as he is in himself. In this respect, it was probably not wise for advocates of complementarianism to ground their view in the eternal intra-Trinitarian relations. According to the Reformed doctrine of the eternal covenant of redemption, we call that the Pactum Salutis, wherein the Father is said to have given to the Son a people, and the Son is said to have volunteered to be the substitute, the mediator, the redeemer of that people, but that obedience was with the incarnation in view. And that's true with the mission or the sending of the Son. Consider an unintended outcome of the controversy over ESS or EFS. More than a few people have dispensed with the adjective complementarian, since it is perceived now by some, maybe many, to carry with it potentially heretical connotations, and because it's been identified with patriarchalism, in which females are said to be, in their being, so ontologically, in their being inferior to males. This is most unfortunate because, as a matter of universal sense perception and experience, the two sexes are, in the nature of things, by divine design, complementary of one another. And you can see that, for example, in Genesis 2:18 through 25, where God's word says, this is the ESV, then Yahweh Elohim said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him." Now out of the ground, Yahweh Elohim had formed every beast of the field, every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. And whatever the man called every living creature, that was its name. The man gave names to all livestock, and to the birds of the heavens, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam, there was not found a helper fit for him. So Yahweh Elohim, obviously I'm modifying the ESV here. So Yahweh Elohim caused a deep sleep to fall upon the man, and while he slept, took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that Yahweh Elohim had taken from the man, he made into a woman. and brought her to the man. Then the man said, "This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So that's obviously a complementary relationship. So the Athanasian Creed here gives us categorical distinctions. With respect to the deity, we say one thing. With respect to Christ's humanity, we say another. That distinction should have a chastening effect on what we say when we're formulating theories such as the so-called alleged eternal subordination of the Son.
Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by Heidelberg Reformation Association.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidel Media production.
For this podcast.